Well, I don't want to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening because you guys could be watching this at whatever time is convenient for you. But this is all something, it struck me that I got like 3 months to go and I'm out of here. I'm looking forward to Pastor Abigail coming. But certainly the Lord has a sense of humor to give this old dog all these things to learn new here. But if 40 years ago I could have, never could have dreamed that there would be things like the technology we have today. But in the time of this pandemic that's going around our world, isn't it great that we have some technology like this so that I can welcome you, whoever you are, watching today. And we are part of the Fresh Start One Church many locations ministry out of the Elmira, New York area. And we're glad you're with us. This is part 4 in a series called Time to Dream, Trusting God to Open Doors. And before I go any further, would you pray with me? Lord, I ask that you be with us and that we not feel isolated from each other, but that we feel connected by Jesus Christ and by the dream that he puts in all of our lives. And I pray that in this time to dream, you would use this message right now to inspire us and give us more insight into what your dreams for us might be. In Christ's name, amen. My district superintendent left me a voicemail this week, saying, Bill, I just wanted to know how you're doing in this unprecedented time. And I must say, this is unprecedented. That 40 years ago, I would not have pictured doing any of this kind of thing. Earlier this week, I had a Zoom video conversation with 8 or 9 other pastors, and we were talking about how God can use this time to push us to develop some new ways of reaching people, and we don't have to do the same thing that we did 40 years ago. But this technology is a great tool and a great way to reach out to people, and we hope that this will be used as a challenge and an opportunity to grow that will become better and stronger because of this pandemic virus experience that we're going through right now. And so I would say to you, stay tuned, come back again. I think there's going to be some more ways that we address the needs of our neighborhood and our world with the technology that God has given us. One of the first funerals that I was called on to do when I came to Pennsylvania Avenue Church in 1998, the lady's first name was Gert, as I recall. And Gert was a woman of faith, and she was under hospice care, and we knew that she didn't have long to be with us. But one of the favorite stories that was popular back then was a story about, you have a family get-together, and you have all the big meal, and then they come around, you clear your plates, but they'll say, keep your fork, because the best is yet to come. The dessert is still to come. And Gert asked at her funeral if we could have everybody receive a fork. And so when you came into Olthoff Funeral Home on the south side, they gave you a fork. What's this about? And then we explained that she had a fork in her hand in the casket as well. She wanted us to realize that the best was yet to come. And so in the time of kind of uncertainty or desperation or fearfulness right now, I would invite you, I wish I was smart enough to have a fork to hold up for you right now, to keep your fork and know that stay tuned, the best is yet to come. Jeremiah 29:11 is a favorite verse of many people, and this is our memory verse today. And if you took the opportunity to download the outline that goes along with this message, you'll see the words there, and they're on the screen as well. Would you read Jeremiah 29:11 with me? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And I want you to remember that address. Where is that? Jeremiah 29:11. And that is such a positive message. But I wanted to remind you of the context of that message was not positive. Jeremiah, they called him the weeping prophet. things were not good for him. He was born in a time of great upheaval and terror and uncertainty. Jerusalem was just hanging on by a thread. They were about to be overcome by Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, to the east and the north of Israel was about to overcome them. And Jeremiah's message was, you're going to lose. God says, don't fight when Babylon comes. This is part of God's plan. He was not a popular prophet. And so the plans that the Lord talks about with Jeremiah, it was not a rosy picture. They were going to be overrun by Babylon, and they would eventually be rebuilt again. But that was a long ways down the road. And so often God's dream for us isn't pretty. It's not a pretty picture. It's not easy. And I think of that particularly when I was first a pastor, and right out of college, they let me be a pastor. I don't know what they were thinking, but it was a Presbyterian church. And I just had college education, a degree in sociology, social work, not prepared to be a pastor by any means, but they must have been desperate. But I was serving this little church between Rochester and Batavia, and one of the first opportunities I had was to go with a couple of friends to Long Island, and it was in Long Island that I heard this speaker, Bill Gothard, Institute of Basic Youth Conflicts, it was called. And one of the things in the presentation that I heard that week that sticks with me today was he talked about a birth of a vision or the birth of a dream, and how often we go through the death of that vision only for it later to be reborn or to come back again. And I think in the Bible there's some examples that come readily to mind. Abraham, for example, was told that he was going to be the father of a great nation. And then years and years and years and years went by. And he's getting older and older, and his wife Sarah is older and older. And nothing's happened. And so Sarah suggests they take matters into their own hands, and she encourages Abraham to have a child with Sarah's servant. And that was Ishmael. And then, finally, the child of the promise came, named Isaac. And then, you know, the story when Isaac was probably a teenager. God says, you remember Isaac, the one I promised to you? I want you to take Isaac, and I want you to go up on the mountain that I'm going to show you, and I want you to sacrifice. I want you to give Isaac to me. How hard that must have been. Birth of a vision, death of a vision. But just at the last second, God intervened, and Isaac was still there. Well, Isaac became the father of Jacob. Last weekend, if you were with us, Jacob was the one that Jacob means deceiver or manipulator. He was a con artist. You know, he was a scoundrel. But he came to grips with God in that wrestling match that we looked at last week in Genesis chapter 32. And coming out of that, the mysterious person, the mysterious man that we think was the Lord himself, wrestled with Jacob and said, well, what's your name? And he says, well, my name is Jacob / deceiver, manipulator. Well, now your name is Israel. And Israel means Prince of God. So God takes what seems to be a lost dream and makes Jacob into the Prince of God. And Jacob's name is now Israel. And Israel had a pinnacle of great success when they had David as their king. David lived about 1,000 years before Jesus, and David was the shepherd king of Israel. Everybody loved David. And then David died, and things gradually went down to Solomon, who started off strong, and he had this aspiration and this dream. God said, well, what do you want? What can I do for you, Solomon? He said, I want wisdom. Please give me wisdom. And God gave him wisdom. But sad to say, Solomon squandered the wisdom on a lot of wrong choices. And Solomon hung on through the kingdom until he died. And then the kingdom divided between the northern and the southern kingdom. and what we call northern Israel, a couple hundred years after Solomon, fell to the Assyrian Empire. And in case you want the dates, it's 721 BC. And then, about 140 years or so after that, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, Judah, fell to the Babylonians. That was the time that I mentioned when Jeremiah lived. And Jeremiah had predicted, had prophesied that they were going to be exiled for 70 years, and then they would rebuild the temple, and they rebuild Jerusalem, and that indeed happened. And that was the temple that existed when Jesus came and when Jesus taught. But shortly after Jesus died, 70 A.D., Jerusalem was this time sacked again by Rome. And they took down the temple and Jerusalem to the point that there was no longer Israel from 70 A.D. until 1948. Some of you were alive in 48, just a couple of you, I think, not too many of you. Gail, were you around then? I don't think you were quite there yet. But so Israel has come back again. The Prince of God has come back. So I just say that there's times of birth of a dream, and then there's the death or great loss, grief over the loss, and then resurgence, and it comes back again. I'd like today, at this point, to focus on Joseph of the Old Testament. And I mentioned the wrestling match of Jacob was in Genesis chapter 32. Not too much after that, in chapter 37 of Genesis, through the rest of the book of Genesis, we read about Joseph and his ability to have a dream and to interpret other people's dreams, and the tests that Joseph experienced, the ups and the downs, if you will, of his life of dreaming and following after God's dream. So there are 4 tests that you'll see, if you have the notes there before you, that Joseph experienced. And the first was the test of rejection. Now, Joseph was the youngest of all these brothers, these sons of Jacob, and Jacob kind of favored Joseph. Any of you ever see the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? I'm pleased to tell you that my daughter starred in that on Broadway. Did you know that? Broadway School here in south side of Elmira. When she was an 8th grader, she was the narrator. So it was like Joseph was obviously the key player, and then the girls' part was Amanda, and shared with somebody else, but Amanda was the best, just saying. But in the story of Joseph, he starts out, he's given this dream, but he's pretty foolish the way he shares it with his family. And just to read a little bit about this in his dream, he has the dream. I'm reading from Genesis 37:5. Had the dream, and he told it to his brothers. These are the older brothers. How many of you are the older child? Can you stand those younger children? They're just obnoxious, aren't they? Well, Joseph seemed obnoxious to his 11 older brothers. He has a dream, and he tells it to his brothers, and they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." How would that go over with the big brothers? And then he goes on. He tells it to his father as well. And they said, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" So they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he said, "Listen, I had this dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were all bowing down to me." When he told his father Jacob, as well as the brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you've had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And I mentioned he gave him that special robe, and that really aggravated the brothers too. So that was the dream, and Joseph loved wearing that robe. And I'm reminded of the time my daughter starred on Broadway, so to speak. And the words of one of the songs that Joseph sings in the beginning of that musical are these: "I close my eyes drew back the curtain to see for certain what I thought I knew. Far, far away, someone was weeping, but the world was sleeping. Any dream will do. I wore my coat with golden lining, bright colors shining, wonderful and new. And in the east the dawn was breaking, the world was waking. Any dream will do. That song is titled, Any Dream Will Do. And it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. It's not any dream, but it's God's dream. And then the song goes on to say, a crash of drums, a flash of light, my golden cloak flew out of sight. The colors faded into darkness. I was left alone. May I return to the beginning. The light is dimming and the dream is too. The world and I, we are still waiting, still hesitating. Any dream will do. So he had that brash arrogance of youth about this dream. And then what happened is he was approaching his brothers. His dad sent him out to find his brothers in the field. He's wearing his flashy robe, and he comes, and the brothers see him at a distance, and they say, hey, this is our chance. We can get rid of him once and for all. One of the brothers said, no, don't kill him. No. Well, look, there's these traders headed for Egypt over there. Let's throw him in the pit here, and we'll trade him away in slavery. We'll sell him to those guys. And so Joseph ends up being sold into slavery and taken off to Egypt. And they take his robe, and they put some animal blood on it, and they take the robe back to Dad and say, Dad, must be this tragedy occurred because we found Joseph's robe here with all his blood on it, and the father grieves and believes it to be true. And Joseph ends up in prison. So talk about rejection. He rejected by his brothers, rejected by the people that he had naively shared his dream with. And then another test that we see in the life of Joseph, besides rejection, is temptation. And we see that in chapter 39. Joseph always kept a good outlook. He had a sweet temperament, a disposition that whatever came his way, he made lemonade when the lemons came his way. And so he's purchased by this guy named Potiphar, at the slave auction. And Potiphar takes Joseph home. And Joseph proves himself to be very conscientious and a great work ethic. And Potiphar just really appreciates Joseph and trusts him. And everything Joseph does for Potiphar turns to gold. And Potiphar really sees how gifted Joseph is. And he gives Joseph control over all his household except his wife. He says, you're in charge of everything except, obviously, for Mrs. Potiphar. Well, Mrs. Potiphar did not have great character. And Joseph, he was a handsome young man. He kind of looked like Pastor Bill, probably, And so Mrs. Potiphar takes a liking to this young man and tries to tempt him, tries to seduce him. And Joseph says, how could I sin against your husband and especially against God? I cannot do this. And he runs from temptation. But she grabs his shirt, and then she cries out to the servants and eventually to her husband that he had done her wrong. And I've wondered, did Mr. Potiphar really believe his wife or not? Had she done this kind of thing before? But he had to save face, and so he has Joseph thrown in prison. So Joseph goes from being in the hole in the ground, sold into slavery, and there's a glimmer of hope as things seem to be looking up, and now he's falsely accused and put into prison with no determinate sentence. He doesn't know how long he's going to be there. He's just forgotten. He feels like he's totally forgotten. And that brings us to the next test that he faced, and that is that state of isolation. So I think of people right now feel isolated in the midst of the quarantine going on right now. There's people that just feel forgotten, or if they're not technically quarantined, they're not able to get out very much. And we're aware of people that are feeling very alone, and loneliness itself can be lethal. And there's people today that we need to think about that we could reach out to that are lonely. And so he's lonely in this Egyptian prison, and he gets to know a couple of the other prisoners, and there's one prisoner in particular that has a reprieve, and he's allowed to be freed, and he's going to go tell Pharaoh about Joseph, except he forgot to do that. And so I can't go into all the details, but Joseph is there experiencing what they call FOMO. You know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out. And he's missing out on God's dream. God gave him this dream, and now what's happening? Everybody's forgotten me. But he still keeps that positive outlook, and suddenly the guy remembers that he's there. His fellow prisoner remembers and tells Pharaoh. When Pharaoh has a dream that puzzles him and confuses him, he says, I know somebody back in prison that could help you. And Pharaoh sends for this person he's never met before, and they got to shave him and clean him up and bring him before the Pharaoh, the king. And in a blink of an eye, things turn in a different way for Joseph, so that he's gone from prison to the palace of the king, just like that. And again, everything he does is upright and righteous and true, and his character comes through. And before long, Pharaoh entrusts Joseph to be the second in command, not of his household, but of all of Egypt. And Joseph helps Pharaoh to realize that there's hard times coming, that after 7 years of plenty and the economy going really great, there are going to be 7 years of famine. We just experienced plenty, whether we realized it or not, in these last months with the stock market when it was close to 30,000. And now it's down, as of today, I think the last I saw it was around 20,000. So what a drop in the economy. Well, Joseph helped Pharaoh realize that things were going to drop like that. And so he went from isolation to power in the kingdom. And turnabout is fair play, and I can't do justice to the story completely, but if you read those last chapters of Genesis, you'll see that turnabout means that Joseph's family, his father and his brothers, are desperate. They're starving to death. And the father sends the brothers to Egypt to just beg for some food to take back to his family. And the brothers don't recognize Joseph. The last they saw him, they didn't expect they were going to see him again. Here Joseph is in this position of power and authority over them, and he could really have gotten even with them. He could have really got a chance for revenge and retribution. But his quality of spirit and his faith came through. Instead of choosing retribution, he chose forgiveness. And I have to read a little bit of that story to you from the book of Genesis. Joseph has these guys right there with him, and he says, it says in Genesis 45, he could no longer control himself before all the court attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And as he did that, he wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him, and Pharaoh's household even heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. I think at that point I would have said, oh, haven't you heard about this social distance? I need to be further away from you. I don't want to be too close to you right now, Joseph. And he said, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be more plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And it goes on to say in Genesis that later on, when their father died, when Jacob indeed died, the brothers, now he's going to get us. So they're still feeling guilty, and they're still sweating. And so they concoct this story. Oh, Dad told us to tell you just before he died. And that's when he went on to say, Joseph said, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good. And he had the big picture of God's dream over his life, so that when he was tested, he didn't succumb to rejection or isolation or temptation or give in to retribution or revenge. But he kept God's dream first and foremost. And so I would ask you today, does this apply to God's working in your life? Is there that dream? We've talked about it before. When plan A seems to be a lost cause, God still says, hey, remember, plan A still applies. That still holds true. God says to us today, through the example of Joseph, that whatever tests come our way, we know that whether it's the test of the coronavirus or it's the test of something else in our lives, that God still has a plan and God can still turn things about for his dream for our lives. Amen? Amen.